There's no seat for inferiors here. Go home. At the company social gathering I attended with my wife, George Foster, the sales director of the West Branch, blurted this out to me. Inferior? What are you talking about? Not understanding what he meant at first, I asked him seriously. Haw. Aren't you my junior? You're definitely inferior. Then he noticed Michelle, my wife, standing behind me. Oh. Are you Scott's wife? Wow, you're too beautiful for him. How about it? Ditch this guy and be with me. I'm happily single right now, you know. He took a step forward, stretching towards Michelle. Could you call your branch president? Haw. The branch president. Hey, what are you starting now? Michelle's icy reply made George laugh foolishly, unaware that it marked the beginning of his downfall. My name is Scott Brown. I'm a 55-year-old sales director at the East Branch of the major RR Group. The RR Group was founded 50 years ago by the current chairman, Frank Wagner. Wagner, with a keen sense of the times, expanded the company rapidly, and it has now grown into a large corporation with over 1,000 employees. After graduating from university, I was attracted to this growing company and joined it. I've been working hard on the front lines for 32 years. Since becoming sales director at the East Branch 2 years ago, I've continued to strive to increase sales. In my personal life, I married Michelle, a colleague, at the age of 28, and we were blessed with a son when I was 30. Currently, our son is studying business administration in graduate school in the UK. It was lonely when he left, but seeing him enjoying his time there reassured me. I have been fortunate with my subordinates and have had a smooth career, but there was one person who troubled me, George Foster, the sales director of the competing West Branch. George, who became the head of the sales department last year, is 2 years older than me at 57. He actually went to the same university as I did, 2 years ahead of me. Even back then, despite acting like a senior, he wasn't very good at looking after others. He seemed to enjoy bossing us, the juniors, around using only his chin, so to speak. I wasn't in the same seminar as him, so I didn't suffer directly, but it seems some of my classmates had quite unpleasant experiences with him. He was very eager to ingratiate himself with those above him, offering to help professors. However, he would push the actual work onto his juniors and then take all the credit for it. Apparently, this was a common occurrence. Occasionally, he would whimsically treat us to drinks and then demand hundreds of times over. "Didn't I treat you?" When reluctantly agreeing, he'd say, "Show some gratitude," and make us pay for his meals in the cafeteria. After being overcharged once too many, we started refusing his treats, to which he'd annoyingly follow and complain. "Can't you drink my juice? Oh, I see." Moreover, he constantly compared himself to others, belittling those he found superior at drinking parties, endlessly lecturing his juniors. If we didn't agree, he'd get more entangled by saying, "You're looking down on me, aren't you?" It was terribly bothersome to deal with. Reluctantly praising him, "I think you are amazing," would improve his mood, but he never treated us in return, as my friends complained repeatedly. For these reasons, George was exceedingly unpopular among the juniors, but since I hadn't interacted much with him, I didn't have a strong impression. Therefore, when I graduated and joined a company related to the RR Group, it didn't bother me that Senior Foster was there. I was honestly happy to have a senior from the same university, and if assigned to the same department, I would have liked to learn from him. However, the moment George realized I was his junior, he thought he had found a good subordinate. So, during my training, he approached me grinning. "Hey, are you Scott?" "Yes, you're George, right? A friend of mine was in the same seminar with you." As I replied, George leaned forward. "Is that so? You're friends with him?" "I took really good care of that guy," George bragged, puffing himself up. "If you're his friend, you should listen to what I say, right?" "Why should I?" Surprised, I responded, and George looked fierce. Why? Because you're obviously inferior to me. I was annoyed by the inferior comment, but since I had just joined the company, arguing with a senior employee was not a good idea, so I swallowed my words. That's right. It's better for you if you just quietly do as you're told, George said triumphantly. Just then, my training supervisor called my name, and he reluctantly moved away. I realized then that if he behaved like this, he'd be disliked by the juniors. Fortunately, once the training was over, I was assigned to a different branch than George, and we no longer interacted. Over 30 years have passed, and I became the sales director of the East Branch. A year later, George also became the sales director of the West Branch, as I learned from the company bulletin. Though I was his junior, I became a director a year earlier. This personnel change eventually led to a conflict with George, who had been out of touch for a while. Well, Mr. East Branch Sales Director, how are you doing? When I attended a meeting at the headquarters, that was George's first greeting after a long absence. During our time apart, his hairline had receded significantly, and his belly had started to protrude. Long time no see, Director Foster. Thanks to you, I'm doing extremely well. I replied nonchalantly, which seemed to irritate him, as he muttered a small "Umph." No, the rising star rumored to be joining the headquarters executive soon, what are you saying? He continued with a pasted-on smile. I should have contributed to the company longer than you, Director Scott, but embarrassingly, I was overtaken by a junior. But finally, my achievements have been recognized, and I can stand shoulder to shoulder with you. How embarrassing. His attitude seemed more self-deprecating than modest as he clung to me and kept talking. Again with that. Not wanting to be entangled, I gave a wry smile and stepped toward the meeting room seat. Well, enjoy it while you can. The company has finally recognized my ability. I'll be promoted faster than you now. He whispered to me quietly, so others couldn't hear. I couldn't help but look at George's face. He was staring at me intently. Let's both do our best. I avoided George's clingy gaze and responded with just those words before looking for my seat. Unfortunately, the seats for the East and West branches were next to each other, and I ended up having to sit beside George. How's East's sales performance? We're pretty confident this quarter. Well, it's expected since I've become the sales director. George spoke to me as if forgetting his earlier words. I chose not to engage much and focused silently on the meeting. The meeting proceeded as usual. At the end, during the sales reports for each branch, West's significant progress was announced. Up until now, West's sales had been barely breaking even, but they had recently signed a contract with a factory that developed new technology, allowing them to forge new business partnerships. I am George, the newly appointed sales director of the West Branch. This time, we've promoted product development with new technology and opened up new business avenues. I am honored to receive your praise. George spoke proudly about the hard work put into developing products with this technology and the efforts to cultivate new business partners. Indeed, West's sales had significantly increased, and the other branch managers and executives seemed impressed as they listened. I, having not seen George for a while, felt a deep sense of reflection while listening to his speech. Therefore, as the person who led West to improve its sales, I plan to exert my efforts to boost the RR Group's overall sales. Please rest assured and leave it to me. George boasted confidently. I thought he was spreading himself too thin, but surprisingly, the executives seemed to appreciate it. Ah, Director George. It's quite something that you can promote yourself to such an extent these days, said one, starting to applaud. The other executives also began clapping, amused. Thank you. I, George, will strive to be of service to everyone. He spread his charm like a politician, giving me a sly glance and a grin. The other branch managers looked dismayed, but with the executives clapping, they couldn't just turn away, so they reluctantly joined in. Honestly, while sales had increased, the technology was limited in scope, and I didn't think it held much value for the RR group as a whole. The executives seemed to be merely entertained by George's speech, with no real discussions about spreading the technology or implementing it in other branches. But George spoke as if he alone carried the future of the RR group, breathing heavily through his nose. He occasionally looked at me with a displeasing smile. As the meeting ended and I stood to leave, George grabbed my arm. "What's the matter? Do you need something? Do I need something? Don't you have anything to say to me? Good job today." As I said this, George raised his voice. "What?" By then, the other people had left the meeting room, and only we remained. Hey, you saw my performance earlier, didn't you? Don't you have anything to say about it? Yes, it was a splendid performance. It's inspired us to not fall behind the West Branch. I replied cheerfully, and George's nostrils flared. Right. But remember, such a feat isn't easy to achieve. You became a director a year before me, but I achieved results faster. From now on, just watch as I continue to increase sales and climb higher. He bragged arrogantly. Internally, I was exasperated, but I knew it was pointless to argue with someone in his state, so I just smiled and nodded. That's right, please continue to do your best. I'll take a leaf out of your book and strive as well. Pleased by my submissive response, George's face softened. I doubt you can match me, but do try your best. Laughing loudly, George suddenly reminded me of something, so I asked. By the way, how is Ryan doing since he transferred from our branch? He's a talented salesman, is he doing well? George's expression twitched as he looked at me. Worried I had asked something I shouldn't have, I felt concerned. Ah, Ryan was from your branch, huh? Yeah, he's fine. I've been training him hard. He spoke awkwardly, probing with his eyes. You and Ryan, were you, close? Do you still hear from him? Yes, he was promising, so I took an interest in him, but I haven't heard from him in about a year. Relieved by my answer, George's expression relaxed. Right. Ryan's been so busy learning under me that he probably doesn't have time to think about you. That's good to hear. I hope he's doing well. Don't worry about someone else's subordinate and just focus on doing your best. Well, I'm busy, so I'll be going now. With that, George hurriedly left the meeting room. His behavior after mentioning Ryan was a bit troubling, but finally freed, I let out a sigh of relief and left the headquarters to return to my branch. Later, a social gathering was scheduled at the headquarters. It was a large-scale event attended by branch managers and executives of the RR Group, something the chairman, who loved lively events, hosted annually. Since becoming a manager, I've attended every year. This time, as partners were allowed, I decided to bring my wife, Michelle, along. Will we make it on time? It's about to start. We should be fine. But who would have thought we'd be delayed just as we were about to leave? While preparing to leave, I received a call about a problem at work, making us almost late. Fortunately, it wasn't a big issue. Michelle said with a smile, dressed elegantly. Luckily, the issue was quickly resolved, and our participation in the social gathering was secured. I thought we might not make it when I got the call. I was worried for a moment that I wouldn't get to wear this dress I bought especially for the occasion. Michelle said playfully. If I couldn't make it, you should have attended on your own. No way. Then who would escort me? That's true. My bad. I can't leave such a lovely wife on her own. We shared a laugh. Despite being married for over 20 years, we've hardly had any serious arguments. While we were talking, we reached our destination, got out of the taxi, and entered the venue for the social gathering. As we were about to enter the bustling venue after registering, I heard someone shout, "Hey!" Without realizing we were being stopped, I continued towards the venue when I heard George's voice. "Hey, Scott. Can't you hear me? Mr. Foster, good evening. Sorry we're late." Turning around, I saw George holding a champagne, already red-faced from drinking. "Good evening, my foot. What are you doing here?" "What do you mean, what am I doing here?" "It's a social gathering today, isn't it? All the directors of the group are attending, aren't they?" As I answered, astonished, George closed in and stood imposingly. "There's no seat for inferiors here. Go home." With his breath reeking of alcohol, George blurted this out. "Inferior? What are you talking about?" Not understanding what he meant at first, I asked him seriously. "Haw. Aren't you my junior? You're definitely inferior. Besides, a director who can't increase sales isn't welcome here." As George sneered, Michelle, standing behind me, stepped forward. "You there? Who might this gentleman be?" Cooled by her calm voice, George seemed to notice Michelle. "Are you Scott's wife? Wow, you're too beautiful for him. How about it? Ditch this guy and be with me. I'm happily single right now, you know." He took a step towards Michelle, stretching his face. "Director Foster, please stop this inappropriate behavior." Angered by his words to my important wife, I felt a surge of anger and firmly stood between George and Michelle. George, not liking this, began yelling with a face redder than before. "Disrespectful. The disrespectful one is you. How dare you defy me, the future of the RR group? You should just quietly hand over your wife to me." As he spoke such vulgar words, Michelle's cold voice rang out. "Could you call the president? Your branch president." I glanced at Michelle in surprise. She was smiling, but her eyes were not. And perhaps due to anger, her face was pale. "Haw. The branch president. Hey, what are you starting now?" George laughed foolishly. "I am Scott Sr. Scott is obligated to listen to me. So, your wife must also listen to me. Just call him now." Michelle's voice was sharp. George flinched and fell silent. This exchange near the entrance caught the attention of the surrounding people. You're George Foster, the sales director of West Branch. I believe President Adams is the president of the West. Call him quickly." Michelle crossed her arms and commanded George. Her tone was not that of the usual good wife and good mother but one of an unwavering and strict resolve. Why do you know my name and the branch president's name?" George muttered, puzzled, looking as if he thought I had told her. "Director Foster, it would be wise to call President Adams quickly," I reluctantly advised him. Whispers around us grew louder. "Director Foster. What's the commotion? I heard you were causing some trouble." Parting the crowd, perhaps summoned by someone, President Adams from the West Branch approached and turned pale upon seeing me and Michelle facing George. "President Adams, it's been a while. This rude person here is your sales director, isn't he?" Michelle smiled at President Adams. Her smile was beautiful but sent a chill down the spine of those who saw it. This is Ms. Brown." "Did this George say something disrespectful?" President Adams stammered, addressing Michelle. "Disrespectful? He told my husband there's no seat for inferiors and to go home, and he said to hand me over, his wife." Without blinking, Michelle glared at George and spoke mockingly. "I don't care if you are my husband's senior or whatever, but why should my husband be deemed inferior by you? My husband has achieved great results and honorably fulfills his duties as a sales director. Michelle, let's stop here. I cannot stand by while you are insulted." Indeed. Insulting Ms. Brown is unforgivable. Trembling, President Adams suddenly apologized. "President Adams. Please, don't." I hurried to help him up. "Haw. Why? President, why are you apologizing to Scott and his wife like this? George stammered, clearly unable to grasp the situation. George. Don't you know? Scott's wife is the niece of Chairman Frank Wagner and one of the major shareholders of our group. What? Indeed, Michelle is a niece of Frank Wagner, the chairman of the RR Group. The Wagner family holds a significant number of shares in the RR Group, and Michelle had inherited them from her late father. Michelle, who had joined the company as my junior because her father had married into the Wagner family, was not known to be the chairman's niece because she did not carry the Wagner surname. I was only informed of this when I proposed to her, and it shocked me to the core. Recognized by Michelle's family, I was also introduced to Chairman Wagner, who said, "I had you investigated, but found no reason to object. Michelle is my beloved niece. I entrust her to your care. However, understand that company and family matters are separate. I will not give you any special treatment." Indeed, the Wagner family, even after joining the RR Group, never received special treatment. They all worked like other employees and advanced based on merit. The current president is indeed the eldest son, but that too was achieved through his recognized excellence. I'd like to think that my successful career progression to director was due to my own abilities. Indeed, most of the executives did not know about Michelle being the major shareholder until she appeared at the shareholders' meeting after her father's death and attended the social gathering with me as a director. The surprised faces of the executives when Michelle and I first attended the social gathering 2 years ago were quite something to behold. As I was reminiscing about this, George, infuriated, lunged at me. "Scott, you advanced faster than me by using your wife's influence. What are you talking about? That's not true at all." While easily disarming a drunken George, who was also shorter than me, I spoke. Pushed away by me, George's face turned red with frustration, and he stomped his feet. "It's not fair. Even though I'm your senior. Fair? Please, don't say such childish things at your age." As I replied in dismay, President Adams, pale-faced, intervened to restrain George. "George. Just apologize, now." "Ugh. Damn. Why should I have to apologize to my junior?" While the two were arguing, I watched in disbelief, and Michelle looked on with anger. Sigh. "Honey, if we keep dealing with him, my uncle will scold us. Let's go inside," Michelle suggested with a sigh, and just as I was about to agree, a heavy voice spoke up. "What's all this commotion? If you block the entrance like this, no one can get in." Chairman Frank Wagner of the RR Group, accompanied by his subordinates, made his appearance. "Eek! Chairman." President Adams jumped and greeted him politely. The onlookers who had been whispering from a distance quieted down in surprise at the chairman's arrival. "Is that you, Mr. Adams? Thank you for coming today. But what's going on here? Isn't that Michelle and Scott?" Chairman Wagner, now 85 years old, still looked vigorous and youthful. His voice was firm, and although it was calm now, it was said that when he was younger, if he got angry, his voice could boom like thunder. Chairman. George, now pale-faced and seemingly sobered up, stuttered. "Aren't you George, the sales director from Adams branch? What's going on with everyone here?" He looked around, but everyone kept silent. "Uncle, I'm sorry to cause a disturbance at such a pleasant gathering. It seems Mr. George here had a bit too much to drink. President Adams, perhaps you should let him rest." Although Michelle had been angry earlier, she decided it would be inappropriate to escalate the situation in front of her uncle, the chairman, and threw a lifeline. Yes. That's a good idea. Thank you. Chairman, George is attending the social gathering for the first time and perhaps got a little too excited. Excuse us." Riding on Michelle's words, President Adams tried to take George away, but George, having thought of something upon hearing his name known by the chairman, approached him. "Chairman, I'm honored that you know my name. You must have heard about my valuable contributions. Apparently, George interpreted the chairman's knowledge of his name very favorably. However, the chairman remembers all the faces and names of his company's directors and above. Michelle had also taught me that remembering such details was crucial for deepening connections at these kinds of events. Indeed. I have heard that the West Branch is doing well because of your efforts. However, drinking too much isn't good. Take some rest and sober up. Chairman Wagner said calmly, nodding to President Adams. Yes. Come on, George. Let's rest over there. I'm not drunk, Chairman. I'm thrilled that you're aware of my achievements. George brushed off President Adams' hand and began to make a speech right in front of the chairman. Just watch. The RR group will grow even larger under my leadership. Next to my achievements, Scott will fade into insignificance. Perhaps we should divorce Scott and Michelle, and marry me instead. His eyes gleaming, he stared at Michelle. Michelle, being stared at, glared back at George with clear disgust. What are you talking about? The chairman asked, puzzled. A secretary approached Wagner and showed him a smartphone screen. It seemed someone had recorded the exchange between George and Michelle earlier and handed it to the secretary. What's this, Mr. Adams? Frank asked quietly, his brow furrowed. President Adams sweated profusely. Michelle, explain this. Frank then turned his gaze to Michelle. As you just saw, Uncle. Mr. Foster insulted both my husband and me. When he learned I was the chairman's niece, he started ranting that my husband's advancement was due to my influence. Listening to Michelle's explanation, Frank frowned in displeasure. So, George, you're saying that I unfairly favored Scott because he is Michelle's husband. I have never done such a thing, and I thought all the employees understood that. No, that's not what I. Realizing he had angered Frank, George stammered, trying to defend himself. He looked around, seeking help, but no one stepped forward to support him. But, Chairman, there is no doubt about my abilities. The fact is, the sales growth at the West Branch is due to my efforts. As George droned on about his achievements, trying to save himself from the crisis, another voice interrupted him. Director Foster. Please stop. The calm voice startled George, and he jumped up. Isn't that Ryan? What's going on? I exclaimed, surprised. There stood Ryan Hill, who had transferred from East to West Branch, looking distressed. Ryan, what's the matter? This gathering was supposed to be for directors and above. Ryan nodded to my question. His usually calm and gentle demeanor seemed worn, giving him a haggard look. It's been a while, Director Brown. Actually, I came here today because there's something I need to discuss with the board members gathered at this social event. I was wondering how I could sneak in when the commotion started, and the receptionists were distracted, so I took the chance to slip in and wait for the right moment. He paused and then looked at Frank. Then the chairman arrived. I thought it was a good opportunity to reveal everything right now. Ryan shouted, his face pale. Ryan, what exactly are you trying to reveal? Stop it. As I approached Ryan to question him, George yelled out. Everyone stopped in surprise at his sudden loud voice. Ryan's just a bit neurotic right now. That's why he sometimes says things that don't make sense. George tried to cover up, moving towards Ryan. Director Foster, I've had enough of you ignoring everything I say, threatening me by submitting vacation requests on my behalf and telling me not to come to work. Ryan shouted at George. Are you one of George's subordinates? Scott seems to know you as well. Tell me what you want me to hear. At this, George visibly began to panic. Chairman, you don't need to listen to this low-level employee. He's sick. He's supposed to be recuperating right now. When I asked you recently whether Ryan was doing well, you told me he was working hard and doing fine. What does this mean, George? Were you lying then? I pressed him, and George bit his lip and fell silent. George, Scott, quiet down. Ryan, go ahead and speak. Frank commanded with a calm but commanding presence, which made me close my mouth as well. Thank you, Chairman. Ever since I was transferred to the West Branch the year before last, I've been continuously exploited by this man, George. According to Ryan, soon after his transfer and being placed under George, he began achieving good results due to his experience and sales acumen. However, whenever he reported these results to George, they were claimed as George's own achievements. Ryan had felt something was amiss, but George would exaggerate any small favor to silence Ryan and used various methods to manipulate him, essentially treating him like a slave. Being a straightforward person, Ryan was almost brainwashed, yet he continued to work. During a sales visit to a factory, he discovered a technology that could be used in their products. He managed to secure a contract with that factory and worked with the product development department to successfully create a new product. This achievement was expected to be a boon for the struggling West Branch. But as production was about to scale up, Ryan was suddenly removed from the project, and George was named the head of this significant project. Ryan's name was erased from the contracts and meeting documents with the development department, and everything was credited to George. The factory contacts Ryan had been dealing with were told that he was ill and recuperating, so George would take over. George threatened Ryan, saying any commotion would tarnish the company's reputation, convincing him to comply. The project was a huge success, and based on that achievement, George was promoted to head of the sales department. George spread rumors throughout the company that Ryan was neurotic and unable to distinguish reality from delusion. Being directly under George and having little contact with others since his transfer, Ryan was isolated. When Ryan became an inconvenience, George used his supposed illness as a reason to confine him at home. Time away from George helped Ryan to deprogram and realize that his accomplishments were being stolen. He thought about how he might restore his reputation. Fortunately for Ryan, there were many who disliked George. Though George flattered those above him, he was harsh to his subordinates, so there were those who secretly sympathized with Ryan. Working together, they gathered evidence of George's tyranny. Now, Ryan was here to expose that evidence at the social gathering. I told those who helped me that they could come here, but I declined. I'm prepared to be fired, but I didn't want to involve anyone else. And this is the evidence, is it? Frank muttered as he examined the file Ryan handed him. Just a moment, Michelle said as she leaned over to look. Being the niece, she could do things that neither I nor the other employees could ever replicate. Indeed, there are logs here of files being altered in the company's main computer system, she said, showing me the file. It's true. And these numbers are. Director Brown, do you realize? This is evidence of embezzlement. What? The records showed that since George's appointment as director a year ago, the sales expenses had skyrocketed. President Adams, did you not notice this? I'm so sorry. President Adams, looking like he might faint, apologized deeply. It takes money to get business, Scott. You understand that, don't you? In the midst of the discussion, George tried to attack Ryan but was restrained by Frank's secretary, shouting in discomfort. Expenses do sometimes arise, but from what I see in these records, I can't believe these expenses are work-related. The file included copies of receipts and photos of George at a location that seemed to be a hostess club, where he was seen laughing with women around him, with no apparent business guests in sight. Damn. Why is there even a photo like this? George was probably tormented by his subordinates out of retaliation for his sneaky ways, prompting someone to investigate his personal life. Even if you hadn't stolen Ryan's achievements, the mere fact that someone felt compelled to investigate you shows how little people think of you. When I said that, George glared at me. A person who is not respected has no right to lead others. Moreover, using company money to satisfy your personal desires is absolutely unacceptable. Isn't that right, President Adams? Uncle. Michelle continued forcefully, causing George to tremble. I'll take these as evidence. President Adams, as part of your supervisory duties, could you please take this man away? We will convene an emergency board meeting tomorrow to decide on further investigations and George's sanctions. George, you are to remain confined to your home until a decision is made. Frank then whispered something to his secretary. I've instructed that he be blocked from accessing the company's computers. Don't get any strange ideas, and wait for your sanction. Frank spoke firmly, and George slumped to the floor, deflated. Come on, George, let's go. President Adams urged, pulling him up and leading him away. Let's start over. Sorry for the disturbance, but let's begin the social gathering. Ryan, you should join too. You and Scott must have a lot to catch up on. Thank you, Chairman. Ryan, I had hoped your transfer to the West Branch would advance your career, but it seems I've done you a disservice instead. I placed my hand on Ryan's shoulder, and he shed tears of relief. Come, there's delicious food over there. Take your time and have a good chat. Michelle gently patted Ryan on the back and smiled. Subsequent investigations corroborated the evidence provided by Ryan and his colleagues, resulting in George's dismissal and a demand for him to return the embezzled funds. Moreover, Ryan faced lawsuits for defamation from other subordinates, leading to significant compensation costs. George, who had long been divorced and estranged from both his parents and relatives, was left without anyone to turn to and had become homeless. He managed to survive by doing day labor, but even there he caused problems, and recently, there were rumors of him scavenging through trash bins. A college friend of mine said, when I told him about George, that it was a fitting end for someone who always envied and used others. Apparently, President Adams has also been demoted. Michelle said over dinner. Yes, he offered to step down himself due to inadequate oversight. He felt responsible for not properly looking out for Ryan and the others. That's rather unfortunate. Michelle remarked, but I remembered the relieved face of President Adams when he came to greet us. No, he seemed hopeful that this would improve the atmosphere at the West Branch. He laughed, saying a company needs to value its workers. Michelle nodded deeply to my words. You should also take a leaf out of President Adams' book and take good care of the people at the East Branch. It all comes back around to help our group grow. Yes, being told that by a shareholder does put things into perspective. Oh, you. We laughed together. Our son would eventually join the workforce, and he might even take on a managerial role. When that time comes, I want him to be someone who values his people. I guess I need to be a role model first. I must never forget these values and continue to cherish my family and colleagues.